Welcome, gun runner.
When we talk about Atari consoles, it's usually the 2600 that gets all the attention, or perhaps people talking about how underrated the 7800 and Jaguar are. But the 5200 doesn't get a lot of the discussion. There are numerous reasons for that, many of which will be discussed in this very video. But it's fair to say that when it comes to talking about Atari in the present day, the so-called Super System is very much the forgotten figure. So that's why I thought it would be the ideal centrepiece for one of my Amazing Facts videos. There are lots of hugely interesting stories and tidbits for trivia regarding the Atari 5200, and it's time to get them out there. They might not change your opinion of the console itself, or indeed its games, but I do think they will help you look at the 5200 in a different light, and perhaps get people talking about it a little more. So this video joins the episodes I've already done on the 2600 Junior and 7800 to create a trilogy of videos on Atari's early consoles, and indeed I've done one on the XE game system too, which many people describe as the 5200 done right. So if you want to catch up on any of those, then check the links in the description. But enough of the shameless self-promotion, let's get on with the video and tell you 10 amazing facts about the Atari 5200 Super System.
Arcade players, get ready. The new Atari 5200 Super System is here. With a controller so advanced it plays arcade. Graphics so real it looks arcade. With arcade hits you can't play on any other system. No other home video system can touch it. The new Atari 5200 Super System. It's as good as you are, maybe even better. Next time.
Strike 3, you're out.
Before the 5200 Super System name was decided upon, Atari went through several different monikers for the console. Of course, what became the 5200 started way back in 1978 with the development of the Atari 400 and 800 computers. Whilst the 800 was always intended to be a powerful home computer, the 400 was originally designed as a console cousin to replace the 2600 VCS. This project was codenamed PAM, a continuation of the female naming theme that started with Stella and the video computer system. But the PAM name actually stuck for a while, and was very nearly used in fact, as Atari also noticed that the name could be an acronym for Personal Arcade Machine. Once the idea to replace the 2600 was dropped, the PAM became a lower priced version of the Atari 800 called the 400, with a simple membrane keyboard. The need to replace the 2600 only raised its head again when Atari started to see new rivals on the horizon, most prominently the much more powerful ColecoVision, and they knew they would need to come up with something quickly in order to compete. With the lack of time to come up with something, due in part to Atari's own complacency, they quickly resurrected the PAM as the Super VCS, before being renamed the Video System X when it was first shown to the press. But as the wood-grain video computer system had been redesigned into the Vader, with its part number being used more prominently, it made much more sense to follow this naming convention with the new console. They figured the Video System X was twice as good as the 2600, and also went back to their earlier name and combined them on the Atari 5200 Super System badge.
Strike 3, you're out.
As I've already mentioned, the 5200 was simply a slightly redesigned Atari 400 computer, removing the keyboard and expansion ports with a fancy new console case put around it. But the lack of computer-based functions wasn't the only change. Atari also gave it a much wider cartridge slot, new controller ports, and an adapted system ROM. These changes meant that despite the hardware itself being near identical to the Atari computers, it wasn't actually compatible with them. Small changes would need to be made to the code of each game to cater for the new ROM and different controllers, which I'll talk about in more detail shortly. A lot of the press of the time thought this was a strange decision, as they could have positioned the 5200 as a console that could be transformed into a full-blown computer, but decided against it. Of course, this idea was revived some 5 years later with the Atari XE game system, which many people described as the 5200 done right. A consolised Atari 8-bit computer that retained full backwards compatibility with all games and was fully expandable into a computer. Shame they hadn't used the same concept back in 1982 really, as I'm sure the 5200 would have been a lot more successful for it.
Strike 3, you're out.
I know you're all waiting for this entry, the single thing that the Atari 5200 is best known for, its highly controversial controllers. One of the biggest selling points of the Super System was its completely different control options, which were radically different to those found on the Atari 2600, Intellivision and ColecoVision. Before I talk about the joystick itself a bit more though, I also want to point out that it wasn't just about what you held in your hand, as the 5200 also featured 4 controller ports. This made it the very first console to have such a feature, nearly 15 years before the Nintendo 64. But it actually wasn't a new idea, as the aforementioned Atari 400 and 800 computers also had the very same multiplayer capabilities. Unfortunately, this feature was removed from the second revision of the Super System, making the earlier models much more sought after. So that controller then. We have to talk about that a bit more now, don't we? Analog joysticks certainly weren't a new thing. They had been around since the 70s and had already been used on the many variations of the advanced programmable video system, including the Interton VC4000, Acetronic MPU 1000 and Voltmace database from 4 years previous. They were also being used on numerous home computers too, including the Apple II, BBC Micro and Dragon 32, though perhaps the 5200 is the most famous example, at least until the Nintendo 64 came along. With all these years of existence, you'd think this was a pretty easy concept to get right, but somehow Atari failed on every single level. Due to the cheap parts that they chose to use, these sticks were incredibly easy to break, which was undoubtedly the most fatal of all its flaws. Then there was the choice to use cheap rubber bases, rather than springs, which meant that they didn't centre properly. Again, this is purely an ill-conceived cost-saving measure. Lastly, the 5200 controllers also proved to be very uncomfortable to hold for long periods of time, causing hand cramp. This was partly due to the inclusion of a keypad on the controller, copying both the Intellivision and ColecoVision. Thankfully, several third parties, most notably Wiko, created alternative controller options that were a hell of a lot better, but the damage was already done as far as Atari and the 5200 was concerned.
Strike 3, you're out.
Once again, we lead on from the last entry, as another innovative feature of the Atari 5200 and its seemingly innovative controller was the inclusion of a pause button. To today's gamer, it probably seems utterly inconceivable to not be able to pause the game. It's something that we do without even thinking. But the first generation of consoles like the Atari 2600, Philips Videopack and Mattel Intellivision had no such feature, although some later 2600 games did utilise the black and white switch for this function. Again, this was a legacy of the 5200's home computer origins, as being able to pause games with a keyboard press had long been possible. Interestingly, despite the pause button being a standard feature of the 5200 controller, later consoles like the Sega Master System, and indeed Atari's own replacement for the 5200, the 7800 Pro system, only had a pause button on the console itself, meaning you had to move your lazy arse to the sofa to make use of it. Not nearly as convenient.
Strike 3, you're out.
We're roughly halfway through this video now, and one thing has already become clear. Atari made a lot of bad decisions when it came to following the success of the 2600, and the poor sales of the 5200 were very much proving that back in 1982, as it was being massively outsold by both the ColecoVision as well as its own sibling. To try and mount a fight back and save the 5200, Atari decided that they needed to give people more reasons to buy the console. Their plan was to create a number of original games that would be exclusive to the system, such as Zari Arena and Black Belt, that can be found in prototype form. But obviously these wouldn't be ready for a while, so they came up with an emergency measure instead. This desperate decision was to limit the release of a number of high-profile arcade conversions and licenses, such as Battlezone, Mario Brothers, Berserk and Looney Tunes, to the 5200, and not release them for the Atari 8-bit computers simultaneously as originally intended. For some reason, Atari thought that this might encourage some people to buy a 5200 over an Atari 8-bit computer, which was outselling its console cousin, and then they could make more money. As with the home computers, the vast majority of software was unlicensed and found on disc or tape, so it provided Atari with no revenue. But they did still release most of these games for the 2600 too, so they weren't really exclusive to the 5200 at all, and the decision to do this really backfired on them, especially once cheaper and equally capable home computers like the Commodore 64 started to arrive on the market.
Strike 3, you're out.
Many people have suggested that the 5200's biggest downfall was the lack of backwards compatibility with the Atari 2600 and its already huge library of games. In fact, this was one of the biggest criticisms of the Super System back in the day too, with much of the press of the time being utterly bemused by the decision. Now this might seem like an extreme reaction to some, but when you realise that the 5200's biggest rival, the ColecoVision, had an Atari 5200 adapter from pretty much day one, you start to see the problem. A similar adapter was also made available for the revised Intellivision 2 console too, so that meant 2600 games could be played on the two biggest rivals to Atari, but not on their own flagship console. A very bulky VCS adapter did eventually arrive the following year, alongside the revised 2-port Atari 5200 console, but this was unwieldy and expensive as it basically included a whole 2600 chipset within it. This was far too late to change the 5200's fortunes and encouraged 2600 owners to upgrade, as the ones that wanted to had already moved on to the ColecoVision. This was why the 5200's replacement, the 7800, was designed with 2600 compatibility from day one, and it was definitely a feature that greatly benefited the Pro System too, so it's a shame we didn't get it earlier. And speaking of the Pro System, there was also a plan to release a 7800 adapter for the 5200 too, giving the existing users who would no doubt be upset at the Super System being replaced just 2 years after its release, a chance to upgrade. But this would be even more bulky and expensive, and never got past the prototype stage due to the takeover of Atari's consumer division by Jack Tramiel and the cancellation of all 5200 projects. Oh, what could have been, eh?
Strike 3, you're out.
I bet you thought I was done talking about the controllers, didn't you? Well, don't switch off just yet, because this one's a much more positive entry, I can assure you, as I'm now talking about the wonderful, and frankly gigantic, Atari 5200 Trackball Controller. The trackball had already been a mainstay of Atari's coin-op division, having featured on hugely popular games like Missile Command, Atari Football and Centipede. However, it had never been available as a control option for the 2600, unlike paddles and the keypad, so the trackball offered a real point of difference for the new console, and unlike the awful joysticks, it was also very well made. In fact, it was every bit as good as it was in the arcades, and its imposing nature, it was nearly as big as the console itself, very much reinforced that. As well as the ball itself, there were also pause, start and select buttons, sandwiched between a separate keypad for each player. It might have been expensive and a bit of a novelty back in the day, but it was certainly one of the best reasons to own Atari's so-called Super System.
Strike 3, you're out.
One of the most famous facts about the 5200 is that it was the only Atari console not to be released worldwide. In fact, it was only ever released in North America, where it sold just over 1 million units. When you compare that to the 30 million Atari 2600s sold, it shows just how far the historic company had fallen. Its closest rival, the ColecoVision, sold over twice as many units in the same part of the world. Both were very much victims of the North American video game crash that saw them discontinued by the companies that made them well before they were due. While America was suffering from the market imploding, the video game industry in the rest of the world, especially Europe, was booming, and so not releasing the 5200 elsewhere may have been a big mistake. The 2600 continued to sell well in Europe right into the 90s, and the 7800 was reasonably successful there too, so you have to wonder how different it could have been.
Strike 3, you're out.
The Atari 5200 is nicknamed Big Sexy for a reason. Despite its sleek and attractive design, the console is absolutely huge. How big, I hear you ask? Well, at 15 inches by 13 inches wide and over 4 inches tall, it's bigger than even the original Xbox. The case even included a hatch on the back that you could open to store your controllers in too. All beers if you're the angry video game nerd. The huge size of the console did nothing to help the cost of producing it either. Atari had already removed 2 of the original 4 joystick ports in a cost-saving measure, and planned to reduce these expenses further with a complete redesign, just as we saw with the 2600 Junior. This model, which was originally known as the Atari 5100 and codenamed Little Pam, was fully prototyped but never made it into production. The North American video game crash had hit Atari hard and made sure the 5200 Junior was dead on arrival, cancelled before it even had a chance to turn things around. The takeover of Atari's consumer division by Jack Tramiel sealed its fate. Jack saw no future for the 5200 and discontinued it almost immediately, preferring to concentrate on the redesigned 2600 and full worldwide release of the 7800 Pro system.
Strike 3, you're out.
Without doubt, the most fascinating piece of trivia about the Atari 5200 is the story around the release of its very last commercial game, Gremlins. It's so incredible, in fact, that I just had to save it until last. I couldn't think of a more fitting end for this video. This story begins in June of 1984 with programmer John Seggers, who had just completed work on Gremlins for the Atari 5200 and 8-bit computer. The final version of the ROM was ready and had been sent to the factory to put on cartridges ready for release. Now, none of this sounds out of the ordinary so far, but things are about to get interesting. You see, the day the ROM was sent was only one day before the Trammell family took over at Sunnyvale. I already mentioned that one of the first things Jack did upon taking over at Atari was kill off the 5200. Although with only a few games being released in 1984, many would argue that it was pretty much dead already. But somehow the 5200 version of Gremlins had escaped Jack's attention, and by the time he found out that it had been sent to production, it was too late to stop it. In the end, thousands of Gremlins carts were produced, but Jack had no intention of releasing them since he had deemed the 5200 officially discontinued. When the executive producer of Gremlins, the one and only Steven Spielberg, found out about Jack's plan, he was livid. Spielberg had closely overseen and personally approved several games based on his films at Atari already, including both E.T. and Raiders of the Lost Ark. This led him to making Jack an offer to buy the entire inventory of Gremlins cartridges from Atari with the intention of releasing them himself, but Jack refused. Apparently it was better to watch them rot in a warehouse rather than let anyone else have them. If Jack's history was anything to go by, then the story would end right here, as he usually got his way. But in a bizarre twist of fate, this stash of Gremlins cartridges would be rediscovered in 1986 and then sent to retail, some 2 years after the last release and the cancellation of the console itself. Nobody knows the exact reason for this, but it must have seemed really bizarre to anyone who witnessed it back in the day. Most of these cartridges ended up at specialist mail order retailers and often went unsold, so it's not unusual to still come across the odd sealed 5200 Gremlins online.
If you think ColecoVision plays all Atari cartridges...
You mean it can't?
Here's Pac-Man on ColecoVision. But here's Pac-Man for the Atari 5200 Super System.
Now you're talking.
And it doesn't work on ColecoVision.
But won't their adapter?
It won't play Super System cartridges.
Not pole position?
Not this pole position.
Not centipede?
Not this centipede. Only on the Atari 5200 Super System.
But aren't they hard to find?
They're everywhere.
Everywhere?
The Atari 5200 Super System.
And that rounds up my look at 10 amazing pieces of trivia about the Atari 5200 Super System. Can you think of any other fascinating facts that should have made the list? And which one of these amazing facts is your favourite? I always love to hear the thoughts and views of my audience, so please get typing in that comments section. Before I go though, I must thank all of my loyal patrons for continuing to support my channel and make videos like this possible. However, I must give special thanks to the following patrons in particular for their much appreciated pledges: Mitchell Valentino, Neptune, Seth A. Robinson, Carl Olsen, Ozzy B, D. Vaughan, DOS Gamerman and Electron Star Collapse. If you also want to help support all my creative endeavours, including this YouTube channel, And please go and check out my Patreon right now. You can get access to host extra content, including downloads, exclusive videos, creative insights and much more besides. I've been the Laird, I thank you for watching, and I'll see you all again for another video very soon.